Thank you for joining us for today's ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Program, How Things Work, the Legal Edition, which is a rapid response project that addresses how our civil rights are being impacted by actions being taken by the new administration. My name is Peter Mina, and I'm the founder and principal of the Mina firm, a federal employment and civil rights law firm in Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to be joined by Kerry Doyle, who is a partner at the firm of Green and Spiegel in Boston, Massachusetts. And we're thrilled to welcome you to this important conversation. And so these videos are really a unique opportunity to address what is happening in America today, clarify any misinformation or disinformation being spread, and explain how civil rights and social justice advocates can act to protect the rights of everyone. And so today's topic is couldn't be more timely and sensitive. And it is about the role of the Department of Homeland Security in incidents of civil unrest, as we've seen all over the country, most notably in Minneapolis and in Portland, Oregon. And so we'll be talking in a series of videos about the dynamics, for example, between DHS and local law enforcement, but explaining the components roles, as well as including ICE and CBP, of course, and then talking a little bit about what members of the public as well as members of the bar can do in dealing with these very complicated situations of constitutionally protected activity, along with law enforcement operations. And so, with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Kerry to explain a little bit about what ICE and CBP are and what they do. Kerry, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody. We're very happy to be here and to explain some of the nuts and bolts of the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. So one great piece of misinformation, I think, that's out there that I hope this video will help clear up is the difference between Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. They're both components of DHS, as is FEMA, TSA, who you deal with at all of the airports, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services that does benefits, accepts your green card applications and your citizenship applications and so forth. It's a vast agency, and the immigration enforcement part of DHS encompasses, as I mentioned, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection. Even within those two components, they both have subcomponents to them. CBP has Border Patrol. So those are the folks in the green uniforms. And traditionally, we saw them at mainly the southern, but also at the northern border. They monitor the borders and check whether the people are coming in properly, arresting and detaining those that they find or encounter who may be arriving without lawful permission. OFO is the other part of CBP. They're at your port of entry. They wear blue uniforms, and they're the folks that you interact with when you're traveling internationally and you're coming through inspection at either a land or sea or air port of entry, presenting your passport or other travel documents as you come through inspection. And those are the two main parts of CBP that you may interact with. Immigration and Customs Enforcement also has really two main divisions that you may see or encounter. One is Enforcement and Removal Operations, or ERO. ERO are the folks that do internal enforcement of immigration laws, both arresting and detaining individuals. So ERO officers are at all the immigration detention sites, whether it's owned by DHS or it's a private prison, or if it's a space that's rented from a state or local entity, you will have ERO officers on site working with the detainees and working on organizing actual deportation and removal from the country. So that's ERO. Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, is another division of ICE. You will see them out doing immigration enforcement it's much rare rarer to see them. They don't tend to do immigration enforcement. They are more criminally oriented, and so they do investigations into both drug smuggling, people smuggling and trafficking, child exploitation. They do a lot of work on child's pornography and sexual exploitation and other exploitation, trafficking of both people and, like I said, drugs. They also have an intellectual property center. So, for example, we saw a lot of discussion about ICE being at the Super Bowl. So HSI is always at the Super Bowls and other major events because they also do national security work. So you have HSI on site doing national security work, also enforcing human trafficking because there's an uptick of human trafficking of women being brought to the site of a Super Bowl. And then there's also intellectual property issues. So, for example, fake tickets, fake merchandise, people trying to sell merchandise as NFL licensed merchandise when it's not. So they tend to be pretty involved. Same thing with the Olympics. You'll have HSI, I'm sure, is on site, but doing security work as opposed to ERO, which is the enforcement and removal operations, which are the law enforcement officers that you're going to see on the ground doing the domestic enforcement. And the one thing, again, I want to highlight when you have seen some of the videos and some of the news coverage of both immigration enforcement in Chicago and Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and Minnesota, as an example. Customs and Border Protection, which normally kind of stuck to their ground, which is generally within 100 miles of a border, which covers a lot of the United States if you look at the map, but they generally kind of hung out in those spaces. But in this administration's really heightened enforcement pressure towards heightened enforcement, CBP has been there in the cities, which is very unique and unusual. You don't normally see CBP in their green uniforms doing law enforcement in more populated areas. Like I said, they do tend to be more out in the hinterlands. In New England, we would see them in New Hampshire often, or in Maine, but rarely you'd see them on the ground in Boston, let's say, or in New York City. Like, it's very unusual. But Greg Bovino, for example, many folks are aware of him. He's a commander of a group called BORTAC, which is a special enforcement unit within CBP, because a lot of them will have these other sort of subunits. He's Customs and Border Protection. And so in Chicago, the helicopters, the Black Hawk helicopters with the people coming down to the apartment building, that was CBP. They were doing that. The marching through the parks with the, armored individuals and armored vehicles, that was CBP. And so he really helped spearhead some of this very aggressive enforcement. The folks that were involved, for example, in Alex Pretty's shooting, those were CBP agents and officers, for example. ERO, as I said, they're normally doing targeted enforcement, looking for a particular person. Under this administration, we're seeing much broader enforcement stops by ERO. Most of the time, you can tell from their vests will say ERO or CBP or HSI. Normally, they'll be at least identified in that way. As I said, CBP green uniforms almost always. ICE, ERO can be plainclothes or normally would be like that. We've seen them in more militarized uniforms with some of this enforcement lately. CBP also can do checkpoints. So it's pretty normal on the southern border through Texas, Arizona to have CBP checkpoints, kind of like a DUI checkpoint, where they can stop and ask people about their status as they go through, like kind of this normalized. So that's not uncommon in the past. Again, though, having CBP doing standard immigration enforcement in urban areas and urban settings really isn't something you would normally see them do. Both CBP and ICE are considered immigration officers, and under the Immigration Act, they're given quite broad authorities to do immigration enforcement, even though, again, you normally see them in kind of these separate places, sort of doing slightly different things normally. But again, with the enforcement uptick, we've seen them coming into assist ERO or working with ERO. Customs and Border Protection has, I think, want to say 30,000 officers right now. It's a pretty big, component within DHS. ICRO only had 6,000 officers. They've been doing a lot of hiring in the last year, so the number's definitely gone up. But ERO is a much smaller, group of law enforcement than CBP, generally speaking. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Kerry. Just a couple of follow-up and wondering if you could explain a little bit about how DHS has been working more with other parts of the federal law enforcement community that have also been brought into the immigration enforcement picture. Are they working, for ICE or for CBP? How are people to distinguish between, let's say, a U.S. Marshal who happens to be helping out ICE on an immigration enforcement mission, or, pick your other federal law enforcement official?
Mhm. Sure. Again, with this current administrations, with the Trump administration's significant emphasis on immigration enforcement and the rapid arrest and removal of as many non-citizens, although unfortunately some citizens are getting arrested too, in their aggression to arrest and remove people. But yes, we've seen both DEA, so Drug Enforcement Agency, we've seen FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations, both part of the Department of Justice. Be involved with some of the enforcement actions, U.S. Marshals, as you mentioned. Also, there is Federal Protective Services, FPS. Usually you can tell they tend to be around some of the federal office buildings. You'll see them with the cars will be identified as FPS, Federal Protective Services. They're actually a smaller law enforcement department that's connected directly with DHS. They're like sort of DHS's law enforcement. And they're smaller, and they do tend to do just security and protection at federal buildings, and then in support of some other agencies. And then the Marshal Service, again, normally works with the U.S. Attorney's offices. So if anyone does criminal work or civil work in federal court, you'll see, federal marshals sort of work with them. If you have a client arrested or charged in a federal criminal case, they'll be held in marshal's custody, for example. So a lot of those folks got pulled into immigration enforcement. I guess I will mention, I know this for a fact for Homeland Security investigations, immigration enforcement is not their favorite thing to do.
Right.
They would rather be
Exactly.
working on drug trafficking, human trafficking, and the criminal cases they do. So, for example, if a truck is caught bringing in drugs across the border, because some very high number, 90% or plus, I think, of drugs come into the United States through ports of entry. And if Customs and Border Protection or OFO find it on the inspection, they call HSI, and HSI comes in, handles the evidence, presents the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution and so forth. Like I said, they do human trafficking, drug trafficking. They investigate human rights abusers who then get charged and then hopefully deported. Like they go after some of the Nazis that had worked in the camps that were found human rights abusers and so forth. So they would rather not. And same with FBI, I would guess. I know them less well because they're over at DOJ, having worked at DHS previously. FBI and DEA, they have obligations on criminal grounds and other things they normally focus on, but this administration really has prioritized immigration enforcement, arrests, and deportations, and so a lot of them were pulled in. So most of the time, I think the main way to tell these different folks that might be there is they do tend to have their initials on their bulletproof vests or their other jackets and so forth with their names and numbers that I'm less familiar with their uniforms. I don't think they
Right.
have uniforms or colors as much as you
Hmm.
can. Again, Customs and Border Protection, I guess the main thing is the green uniforms are going to
Right.
be CBP, and they tend to really wear those almost, all the time.
All right. So, and then just one clarification. I think it's green is Border Patrol and blue is
Mhm.
OFO, or Office of
Exactly.
Field Operations.
Exactly.
So, all
Exactly.
right. Well, so moving on to kind of, and actually, you made a great reference to the Federal Protective Service. That kind of gets to, in short order, sort of the interplay between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement, especially in the context of protest activity or what you often hear referred to as civil unrest. And so, as you mentioned, FPS is, they're the primary security force as it relates to federal buildings. And generally, when DHS law enforcement officers engage in uh, law enforcement activities outside of their normal duties, it is usually in support of FPS in that security mission. And what you've seen in the current administration is that line get either severely blurred or in sometimes just stepped over and engaging in much more what you would consider to be law enforcement activity of, local law enforcement agencies and officers. And so, in a civil unrest standpoint, in a civil unrest situation, excuse me, the fundamental question really is in law enforcement engaging in the prevention or the addressing of criminal behavior, which is, of course, their appropriate role, or are they interfering with constitutionally protected activity? And often, there's a whole lot of training, and FPS, to their great credit, is excellent at public order policing, which addresses a lot of these issues. Unfortunately, we aren't seeing as much of that in the current environment. But that is generally the division of labor, as it were. There are some exceptions to that, as we've seen also in some of the National Guard cases. Lots of lines getting blurred in terms of authorities. But that is probably a topic for another video. Then I think, one of the other things that is also prominent, certainly as we've seen in Minneapolis and in Portland and around the country, are DHS rules as it relates to use of force. And the primary standard, which comes from both Supreme Court case law as well as DHS's own use of force policy that was last updated in 2023, is the idea that use of force by a DHS law enforcement officer needs to be objectively reasonable. That is the key phrase. And that really governs every time a DHS law enforcement officer comes into contact with a member of the public. And also, there is significant guidance in terms of the balance between the use of less lethal force and certainly in in an emergency circumstance and under different criteria, the use of deadly force. And there's a fair amount of training on that policy, both at the component level as well as at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And that can include training, for example, on de-escalation. There are guidelines regarding the use of chokeholds. And then also in really quickly, there are also use of force review processes. So when there's been an incident of the use of force, there are, multiple use of force review boards, for example, at CBP at the local level, as well as a national use of force review board that handles more serious incidents of use of force, including deadly force. And at CBP, that use of force review board will often address the question of whether misconduct occurred. There is also an ICE use of force review process, though they don't necessarily get to that key question. As we'll talk about, that is the role of the Office of Professional Responsibility. However, they do look at general policy compliance as well as the need for training. And so, with that, I'm going to quickly turn it over to Kerry to talk a little bit about your constitutional right to record encounters and potentially broadcast information regarding enforcement.
You do have a First Amendment right to record and observe any kind of law enforcement activity. That includes ICE or CBP, but it's very important that you don't interfere and that you don't in any way get in the way or prevent them from doing their work. So it's important to stay on the sidelines. Please record. It is extremely helpful to do that. I would also recommend taking notes immediately afterwards, so that you're aware of from your memory what happened. But you cannot, for example, legally, you're welcome to do what you choose, but you cannot legally put yourself in between, let's say, an ICE hero officer trying to effectuate an arrest and an individual there trying to arrest. You also have to be very careful about not hiding someone on purpose or advising them how to hide or to escape ERO or ICE officers or CBP, because you can be liable for actual criminal behavior if you assist somebody in evading immigration and customs enforcement. So it's fine. And we encourage you to observe, to videotape, and to record. If you are arrested or detained for doing that, again, please take a record, please write notes down, and please get in touch with some of the groups and organizations that are tracking this. Some state attorney generals are tracking ICE activity and CBP activity in locations, as are groups such as the ACLU in their states that are tracking this. But it's very important that there be a record and that you assist in creating that record for the activities that have occurred.
Thanks, Kerry. And then quickly in the time that we have left, just want to cover a little bit about what you do when you do come into contact with a DHS law enforcement officer. As Kerry mentioned, do not, or at least our recommendation based on the authorities, obviously it's your choice, is that you cannot actually interfere in the middle of an operation. Um, Certainly be compliant as you can in those situations. And then if there is something that you believe to be misconduct on the part of a DHS law enforcement officer, the first step is to report that misconduct either to the Office of the Inspector General, which has a hotline, or each component that we've talked about, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, as well as Customs and Border Protection, has an Office of Professional Responsibility, or as some people might be more familiar, like an Internal Affairs. And both of those places, CBP has the Joint Intake Center, and ICE has the Integrity Coordination Center that receives allegations of misconduct. They are reviewed by those respective offices of professional responsibility, and investigations are conducted into those allegations. And then, should there be, misconduct identified, that can be presented to agency officials for consideration of discipline. Lastly, though it is largely dormant, there is the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, separate and apart from the misconduct question. If you believe that your civil rights or civil liberties have been violated, they do still receive allegations. And so there is also on the DHS website an online complaint portal for those complaints. And so much more to come in terms of the discussion of remedies for our members of the bar, as well as members of the public. And keep an eye out for future videos as we go into more detail about the role of DHS, the appropriate role of DHS, as well as the importance of First Amendment protected activity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.